The growling woke Rebecca first, a deep, urgent rumble, unlike any sound she'd heard from Max before. Through the darkness, she saw the German shepherd's silhouette in Emma's doorway, hackles raised. Before she could shake Scott awake, Max had already disappeared into the nursery. "Max! No!" she screamed, bolting upright. The sickening sound of fabric tearing cut through the night. Scott stumbled from bed as Rebecca's bare feet hit the floor running. Their 11-month-old daughter's cry pierced the hallway, through the nursery doorway. Rebecca froze. Max had Emma's pajamas clenched in his powerful jaws, dragging her tiny body across the floor. "He's gone mad!" Scott shouted, lunging forward. Max bolted baby in tow down the stairs and straight through the dog door. Across the moonlit lawn they chased him, Rebecca's heart hammering against her ribs. "Drop her!" Scott screamed, reaching for Emma just as the night exploded behind them. The blast knocked them face first into the dewy grass. Heat scorched their backs as their home erupted into an inferno of glass, wood, and flame. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Millers had settled in Pinewood, Oregon just 14 months ago, drawn to its towering pines and tight-knit community. Scott, a broad-shouldered construction foreman with calloused hands and a determined jaw, had fallen in love with the century-old craftsman on Maple Street. The sagging porch and outdated wiring hadn't deterred him. They'd represented opportunity. "I'll fix it up right," he'd promised Rebecca, his high school sweetheart and now wife of 12 years. "Make it perfect for our family." Rebecca taught 3rd grade at Pinewood Elementary, where parents appreciated her patient smile and firm but gentle approach. She'd been the one to insist they needed time to settle into the house before bringing home a baby. But after years of disappointments and medical procedures, Emma's arrival had seemed nothing short of miraculous. Their daughter, now 11 months old, had Scott's striking blue eyes and Rebecca's dimpled smile, a perfect blend of them both. Max had come 3 months before Emma. Rebecca had spotted him at the county shelter, a dignified German shepherd with intelligent eyes that followed her every move. The shelter worker mentioned his previous owners had surrendered him after moving to an apartment that didn't allow large dogs. Something about his steady gaze had called to Rebecca, though Scott had been hesitant. "We've got a baby coming," he'd reminded her. "A dog that size is a lot to handle." But Rebecca had been adamant. "He's special. Scott, I can feel it." Their next-door neighbor, Frank Wilson, had approved. The 72-year-old retired fire chief often sat on his front porch, observing the neighborhood with a vigilance that hadn't diminished since retirement. "Good breed," he'd commented, watching Scott walk Max around the property. "Loyal, smart, too. Smarter than most people I've met." What none of them knew then was the history written in Max's official paperwork, a past that included specialized training before he'd been deemed too independent for his original purpose. The shelter had simply labeled him as good with children and house-trained. No one mentioned his exceptional sense of smell or his stubborn determination when he detected danger. In the Miller household, Max had quickly established himself as Emma's silent guardian, sleeping beside her crib and watching with alert ears whenever visitors approached her. The day began like any other Tuesday in mid-September. Scott left for the construction site at dawn, kissing Rebecca and Emma goodbye, while Max watched from his spot near the kitchen door. Rebecca had planned a simple day grocery shopping in the morning. Emma's pediatrician appointment at 1, then home for Emma's nap while she graded papers. But by mid-afternoon, something had changed. Max refused his dinner, an unprecedented event in the Miller household. The German shepherd circled the kitchen restlessly, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors Rebecca had insisted on preserving during their renovation. "What's gotten into you?" Rebecca murmured, watching as Max abandoned his untouched food bowl to pace between the kitchen and the basement door. She placed her hand on his head, surprised to feel him trembling beneath her touch. "You feeling sick, boy?" Max whined, nudging her hand with his nose before returning to the basement door. He scratched at it once, then looked back at her expectantly. "Nothing down there but Scott's tools," she told him, opening the door to prove her point. Max bounded down the stairs, sniffing frantically at the corners of the unfinished basement. Rebecca followed, bouncing Emma on her hip. "See nothing exciting?" The basement housed Scott's workshop, the new water heater he'd installed last month, and the furnace that had come with the house. Scott had been particularly proud of the money they'd saved by doing most of the updates themselves instead of hiring contractors. "Construction foreman by day," he'd joked. "Home improvement wizard by night." Max circled the furnace 3 times, then sat before it, releasing a low growl that made the hair on Rebecca's arms stand up. "Enough of that," she said firmly, suddenly uneasy in the dim basement. "Come on, upstairs. Emma needs her bath." Throughout the evening, Max's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He refused to leave Emma's side during her bath, something he normally avoided. When Rebecca settled in the rocking chair to feed Emma her bedtime bottle, Max positioned himself at her feet, amber eyes fixed on the vent near the nursery floor. "You're acting weird," Rebecca told him, stroking his ear with her foot. "Is it a mouse? Please don't tell me we have mice." When Scott arrived home at 7, Rebecca mentioned Max's strange behavior. "Probably jealous," Scott said, heating up the plate she'd saved for him. "Dogs get like that sometimes when they're not the center of attention anymore." "It's not jealousy," Rebecca insisted. "He adores Emma, and he keeps scratching at the basement door." Scott sighed, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "Rebecca, we've talked about this. You can't humanize him so much. He's a dog, a good dog, but still just an animal." This was an old argument, one that had intensified since Emma's birth. Scott had grown increasingly concerned about Max's size relative to their daughter, especially as she became more mobile, just last week. He'd suggested that maybe Max would be happier on a farm somewhere, which had led to 3 days of tense silence between them. "I know what dogs act like," Rebecca countered. "I grew up with them. This is different." After dinner, Max's pacing expanded to include the entire first floor. He would stand at the front door, whining, then trot to the back door, only to return to the basement entrance. Twice. Scott found him standing over Emma's crib, ears erect, body tense. "That's it," Scott said, around 10 o'clock, after Max had barked sharply at nothing for the 3rd time. "He's sleeping in the garage tonight. I can't have him waking Emma every hour." "Scott? No," Rebecca protested. "Something's wrong. Maybe he's sick. Or maybe there's something in the house we're not noticing." "Like what?" Scott demanded, his patience visibly thinning. "Ghosts, burglars. The house is secure. Rebecca, I checked all the windows and doors myself. Max is just having an off day." Their argument continued in hushed tones as they readied for bed, neither willing to concede. Finally, Rebecca suggested a compromise. Max could sleep in their bedroom instead of his usual spot in the nursery. "Fine," Scott agreed reluctantly. "But if he keeps this up tomorrow, I'm calling the vet. Maybe he needs something to calm him down." As they settled into bed, Max remained standing, his body rigid beside Rebecca's side of the mattress. Even in the darkness, she could see his eyes fixed on their bedroom door, his ears shifting at sounds too faint for human detection. What Rebecca couldn't know was that Max had been detecting something since early afternoon, a faint, dangerous smell seeping slowly from the aging gas line. Scott had tightened himself rather than paying for a professional inspection. The leak had started as a pinprick, but with each passing hour, invisible danger filled the Miller home with increasing urgency. At midnight, with Rebecca finally drifting into an uneasy sleep beside him, Scott stepped quietly into the hallway. Max followed, his nails clicking softly against the hardwood. Scott beckoned the dog downstairs, away from their bedroom where their whispered conversation might wake Rebecca. In the kitchen, bathed in the dim glow of the range hood light, Scott crouched to Max's level. The German shepherd's eyes, alert and anxious, met his with an intensity that made Scott uncomfortable. "Look, boy," Scott whispered, running his hand along Max's thick coat. "I know you and I haven't always seen eye to eye, but you're making Rebecca worry. Whatever's gotten into you, you need to settle down." Max whined softly, turning toward the basement door again. Scott sighed, reaching into his pocket for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he'd saved just 3 days earlier, Jason Lawson, a former Army buddy who ran a working farm outside Portland and had mentioned needing a good guard dog for his property. The text Scott composed was brief, still interested in the German Shepherd. "Thinking it might be best for everyone, can discuss details tomorrow." He pressed send before he could reconsider, then slipped his phone back into his pocket. The weight of guilt settled in his stomach, but Scott pushed it aside. This was about Emma's safety. Dogs were unpredictable, no matter how well trained, and Max was nearly 90 pounds of muscle and powerful jaws. One accident, one moment of aggression or overexcitement around his daughter, and Scott would never forgive himself. What Scott couldn't know, was that Max's heightened senses had been detecting the steady accumulation of natural gas seeping from the connection Scott had improperly sealed when installing the new water heater. The aging gas line had a microscopic fracture that had gradually worsened over recent weeks. Tonight, the leak had accelerated. Scott returned to bed, leaving Max in the hallway. The dog remained standing, torn between his instinct to stay near the family and his growing awareness of the danger building throughout the house. When Scott closed the bedroom door, effectively blocking Max from his humans, the German Shepherd's anxiety intensified. By 2 a.m, Rebecca woke to Max scratching frantically at their bedroom door. She slipped from bed, careful not to wake Scott, and opened it. Max immediately pushed past her legs and headed straight for Emma's nursery. "Max!" "No," Rebecca whispered firmly, following him. "You'll wake the baby." But Max was already standing beside Emma's crib, his body rigid with tension. He looked back at Rebecca, then to the sleeping infant, then to the heating vent near the floor. A low, rumbling growl emerged from his throat. "What is it?" Rebecca asked. growing concerned. She checked Emma, who remained peacefully asleep, then examined the windows and closet. Nothing seemed amiss. Yet Max's behavior was so unusual that she couldn't simply dismiss it. Rebecca crouched beside him, stroking his fur. "You're really worried about something, aren't you?" The dog's intelligent eyes met hers, and for a moment, Rebecca felt a chill of genuine fear. She stood, lifted Emma carefully from her crib, and carried her back to the master bedroom. "Scott," she whispered, shaking her husband's shoulder. "Wake up. Something's wrong." Scott rolled over, blinking in confusion at the sight of Rebecca holding Emma, with Max crowding anxiously behind them. "What time is it?" "Almost 2:30, Rebecca answered. "Max is acting strange. I mean, really strange. He won't leave Emma's room, and he keeps growling at nothing." Scott sat up, rubbing his eyes. "We've been through this. Beck, he's just... No." Rebecca cut him off. "This isn't jealousy or attention-seeking. I'm telling you. Something's wrong." Scott's phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Jason. "Definitely interested in the shepherd. Can pick him up this weekend if that works." Rebecca caught a glimpse of the message as Scott hastily silenced his phone. "Who's texting you at this hour about Max?" The color drained from Scott's face. "It's not what you think. You're trying to get rid of him." Rebecca's voice rose, causing Emma to stir in her arms. "Behind my back. I'm trying to keep our daughter safe," Scott countered, his own voice hardening. "Max is too big, too unpredictable. What happens when Emma starts walking and pulls his tail or ears? What if he snaps at her? He would never hurt Emma," Rebecca insisted. "He protects her. He's an animal, Rebecca, not a person, not a babysitter, just a dog with instincts we can't fully understand or control." Their argument escalated, with Emma now fully awake and fussing between them. Max paced anxiously at the foot of the bed, occasionally returning to the door to whine and scratch. "Look at him," Scott gestured in frustration. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. He's acting erratic. What if next time, instead of pacing and whining, he decides to bite? He's trying to tell us something," Rebecca insisted, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. Scott threw his hands up. "Like what? That he needs to go out, that he heard a raccoon, that he's annoyed we're paying attention to our daughter instead of him." "I don't know," Rebecca admitted, bouncing Emma gently to soothe her. "But I know Max. This isn't normal behavior for him." "That's exactly my point," Scott said, his voice lowering as he tried to regain his composure. "Let me take Emma. You take Max outside. Let him burn off some energy, and then we're all going back to sleep. Tomorrow. I'm calling the vet." As Rebecca handed Emma to Scott, Max suddenly stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still, head raised, ears forward. The behavioral shift was so dramatic that both humans paused their argument to watch him. Max turned his head slowly, methodically, as if calculating something beyond human perception. Then, without warning, he leaped onto the bed, seized Emma's pajamas carefully between his teeth, and yanked the baby from Scott's startled arms. Before either parent could react, Max was bolting for the stairs, dragging Emma, who had begun to wail in terror, behind him. The immediate aftermath of the explosion plunged Maple Street into chaos. Fire engines wailed in the distance as neighbors emerged from their homes in various states of undress, drawn by the thunderous blast that had shattered windows and set off car alarms up and down the block. The Miller home was now a roaring inferno, flames shooting 50 feet into the night sky, illuminating the neighborhood in a hellish orange glow. Scott lay sprawled on the damp grass, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. One moment he had been chasing Max, fury and terror mingling as he watched his dog drag his baby daughter across the lawn. The next, he was face down in the grass, ears ringing, lungs burning from the superheated air that had rushed over him. Rebecca lay beside him, her nightgown singed, hair wild, face contorted in shock. "Emma!" she screamed, scrambling to her knees. Their daughter wailed from several yards away, still in Max's protective grasp. The German shepherd stood over the baby, his body positioned between the child and the burning house. Hackles raised as he faced the inferno. Scott crawled toward them, his legs refusing to support his weight. "Emma!" he gasped, reaching for his daughter. Max released his gentle hold on the baby's pajamas, allowing Scott to gather her into his arms. The dog's muzzle was singed. Scott noticed. The fur around his face darkened from the blast. "Is she hurt?" Rebecca asked, her voice cracking as she pressed against Scott's side, hands frantically checking their daughter for injuries. Emma's cries were robust and indignant, the wails of a frightened but uninjured child. Her pajamas were torn where Max's teeth had gripped them, but her skin beneath was unmarked. Scott clutched her to his chest, his entire body trembling with adrenaline and dawning realization. "He saved her," Scott whispered, looking at the dog who now stood at attention, watching the burning house as if standing guard. "He saved all of us." Frank Wilson was the first neighbor to reach them, moving with surprising agility for his 72 years. The retired fire chief's experienced eyes took in the scene in seconds, the intensity of the flames, the collapsed section of roof, the family huddled on the lawn. "Gas explosion," he stated grimly, helping Scott to his feet. "You're lucky to be alive. All of you need to move further back. There could be secondary explosions." As if summoned by his words, another boom rocked the night as something in the garage ignited, sending a fresh plume of flames skyward. Max barked sharply, herding the humans further from danger. "My home," Scott said numbly, watching as 30 years of mortgage payments and 14 months of renovations dissolved into ash before his eyes. "Everything we own—" "You're alive," Frank reminded him firmly, guiding the family toward his own house across the street. "Everything else can be replaced." Inside Frank's tidy living room, reality began to set in. Rebecca sat on the couch, wrapped in one of Frank's deceased wife's bathrobes, clutching Emma to her chest. The baby had settled somewhat, though she still whimpered occasionally, her small face buried against her mother's neck. Scott paced by the window, watching as firefighters battled the blaze that had been his home. Max lay at Rebecca's feet, exhausted but alert, his eyes never leaving Emma. "He knew," Rebecca said softly, breaking the stunned silence that had fallen over them. "He was trying to tell us all evening. That's why he kept going to the basement. Why he was so agitated." Scott turned from the window, his face ashen in the dim light. "The water heater," he said, the words barely audible. I installed it myself last month. What do you mean? Rebecca asked. Scott couldn't meet her eyes. I did the gas connection myself. Saved us $800 on the plumber. The implications of his confession hung in the air between them. Frank, who had been quietly making coffee in the kitchen, paused in the doorway. You connected a gas line without a license? The retired fire chief asked, his voice carefully neutral. Scott nodded miserably. I've watched the pros do it dozens of times on construction sites. It seemed simple enough. Jesus Christ, Scott, Rebecca whispered, her arms tightening around Emma. You could have killed us all. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Scott flinched, then straightened his shoulders defensively. I was trying to save money, for Emma's college fund, for the repairs the house still needed. The house that's now a pile of burning rubble, Rebecca said, her voice rising. Our home, Scott. Everything we had. Max lifted his head at her distress, letting out a soft whine. Rebecca's hand dropped automatically to stroke his head, her fingers finding the singed fur around his muzzle. He tried to warn us, she repeated. And you wanted to get rid of him. The arrival of emergency services temporarily suspended their argument. Paramedics insisted on taking them to the hospital to be checked for smoke inhalation and injuries. Animal control was called for Max, a standard procedure that Scott might have welcomed yesterday but now fought vehemently against. The dog stays with us, he insisted, standing protectively between Max and the animal control officer. He saved our lives. By dawn, the Millers had been examined, treated for minor burns and smoke inhalation, and released to the care of Frank Wilson, who had offered his guest room until they could make other arrangements. The fire department had contained the blaze, though nothing of the Miller home remained salvageable. The insurance company had been notified, though Scott's illegal work on the gas line complicated matters significantly. As morning sunlight streamed through Frank's kitchen windows, Scott sat at the table, his untouched coffee growing cold before him. Rebecca had finally fallen asleep upstairs with Emma nestled beside her. Max lay in the hallway outside the guest room door, maintaining his vigil despite his own exhaustion. You really didn't know about the dog? Frank asked, sliding into the chair opposite Scott. Scott shook his head. Know what? Frank studied him for a moment, then sighed. When you first moved in, I recognized something in your dog, the way he carried himself, how he responded to commands. I figured you knew. Knew what? Scott repeated, irritation edging into his voice. Max has had training, Frank said. Specialized training. I'd bet my pension on it. My brother-in-law worked with military dogs before he retired. Max has that same look about him. Scott frowned, remembering the shelter workers' vague explanation about Max's previous owners. They just said he was surrendered when his family moved to an apartment that didn't allow large breeds. Frank nodded thoughtfully. Could be, or could be there's more to his story. Either way, that dog has some kind of background in detection work. Dogs like that are trained to alert to specific scents, explosives, drugs, even medical conditions. Natural gas has a distinctive odor that trained dogs can detect at concentrations far below what humans can smell. The revelation settled over Scott like a physical weight. If Frank was right, Max hadn't just been acting strangely, he'd been desperately trying to alert them to danger, using the training he'd received long before becoming part of their family. I was going to give him away, Scott admitted, the words bitter on his tongue. I texted a friend last night about taking him. Frank didn't judge, just nodded slowly. Well, I'd say you owe that dog a pretty significant debt now. By mid-morning, the Miller's story had begun to spread through Pinewood. Local news vans parked along Maple Street, reporters eager to interview the family saved by their heroic German Shepherd. Scott declined all requests, unable to face the cameras knowing his negligence had caused the disaster in the first place. Their insurance agent arrived at Frank's house shortly before noon, his expression grave as he explained the complications they now faced. Homeowners insurance typically doesn't cover damages resulting from unpermitted or unlicensed work, he explained gently, especially when it involves gas or electrical systems. So we've lost everything and we're not covered? Rebecca asked, her voice hollow. She sat on Frank's couch, Emma asleep in her arms, Max at her feet. I didn't say that, the agent clarified. But there will be an investigation. Best case scenario, you might receive partial coverage. Worst case. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Scott and Rebecca both understood the implications. They could be facing financial ruin on top of losing their home and possessions. As the day progressed, the community of Pinewood began to rally around the Miller family. By afternoon, a local church had organized a clothing drive. The elementary school where Rebecca taught had started a GoFundMe campaign. Scott's construction colleagues arrived at Frank's house with gift cards, offers of temporary housing, and promises of help rebuilding when the time came. But beneath the outpouring of support ran an undercurrent of judgment. Scott overheard whispers, caught sideways glances. Word of his DIY gas connection had spread, along with speculation about his competence and responsibility. At the construction site where he worked, safety was paramount, yet in his own home. He had cut corners in ways that endangered his family. As evening approached, Rebecca found Scott sitting alone on Frank's back porch, staring into the gathering darkness. Max lay nearby, his vigilant eyes following Emma as she crawled on a blanket under Rebecca's watchful gaze. The fire marshal wants to speak with you tomorrow, Rebecca said, her voice carefully neutral. About the water heater installation. Scott nodded without looking at her. I know. Are there going to be legal consequences? Probably, Scott admitted. Unpermitted work, possible negligence. I don't know exactly what charges could apply. Rebecca sat beside him, shifting Emma to her lap. Why didn't you just hire the plumber? Scott, we could have afforded it. Could we? Scott challenged, finally meeting her gaze. Between the mortgage, the roof repairs, the medical bills from Emma's birth, I was trying to stretch every dollar. I thought I could handle it. You should have told me we were struggling, Rebecca said softly. We could have figured something out together, something that didn't involve risking our lives. Before Scott could respond, Max suddenly stood, his attention fixed on something in the yard. A moment later, a police car pulled into Frank's driveway. 2 officers approached the house, their expressions solemn. Scott Miller, the taller officer called. We need to speak with you, sir. Scott rose slowly, already knowing what was coming. The reckoning for his choices had arrived sooner than expected. I'll be right there, he called back, then turned to Rebecca. I'm so sorry, he whispered, for everything. As he walked toward the waiting officers, Scott felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He had tried to save money and nearly cost his family their lives. He had distrusted the very creature who had saved them all. Now, he would have to face the consequences of those choices, whatever they might be. Behind him, Max rose to follow, still fulfilling his self-appointed duty to protect the family, even the member who had been ready to send him away. The German shepherd's loyalty, in the face of Scott's betrayal, felt like the sharpest rebuke of all. 3 days after the explosion, Scott sat in a stark conference room at the Pinewood Fire Department headquarters. Across the table, Fire Marshal Dennis Caldwell reviewed a stack of photographs, blackened debris, the twisted remains of a water heater, close-ups of ruptured gas lines. Each image was a damning piece of evidence that Scott could not deny. "Mr. Miller," Marshal Caldwell said, setting down the last photograph, "our investigation has confirmed that the point of origin was indeed the improperly installed gas line connecting to your water heater. The threading was inadequate, and there was no evidence of proper sealing compound. This created a slow leak that, over time, allowed gas to accumulate throughout your home." Scott nodded, his throat tight. "I understand. Do you have any formal training in gas line installation or plumbing?" "No, sir." "Were you aware that in Oregon, connecting gas appliances requires a licensed plumber?" "Yes," Scott admitted, the single word heavy with consequence. Marshal Caldwell leaned back in his chair, studying Scott with a mixture of professional detachment and human sympathy. "You're fortunate, Mr. Miller. Most gas explosions of this magnitude don't leave survivors." The fire marshal pushed a document across the table. Scott recognized it immediately, the official incident report that would determine insurance coverage, potential legal penalties, and perhaps even criminal charges. "I'm recommending that the county prosecutor review this case for possible charges of reckless endangerment," Marshal Caldwell said. "However, I've also included my professional assessment that there was no malicious intent, only misguided DIY efforts." Scott stared at the document, the technical language swimming before his eyes. "What happens now?" "That's largely up to the prosecutor. Given that there were no fatalities or injuries to anyone outside your family, they may opt for a fine and mandatory safety classes rather than criminal charges. But I can't make any promises." As Scott left the fire department, the weight of potential legal consequences pressed down on him. But even heavier was the knowledge that his attempt to save $800 had nearly cost him everything that mattered. He drove to the motel where his family was now staying, courtesy of the Red Cross Disaster Relief Program. The modest room with its 2 queen beds and kitchenette felt simultaneously cramped and empty, crowded with the 4 of them plus Max, yet barren without their personal belongings. Family photos, and the accumulation of memories that had made their house a home. Rebecca sat on one of the beds, sorting through a box of donated clothing for Emma. The baby played on a blanket on the floor, closely supervised by Max, who had barely left her side since the night of the explosion. The German shepherd looked up as Scott entered, but did not rise from his post. "How did it go?" Rebecca asked, her voice carefully neutral. The past few days had established a fragile truce between them, too exhausted for continued argument, too interdependent in crisis to maintain anger. Yet the breach of trust remained unhealed. "About as expected," Scott answered, sinking onto the edge of the other bed. "The fire marshal is recommending charges, but he also put in a good word about lack of malicious intent." Rebecca nodded, returning to her sorting. After a moment, she said, "Dr. Landon called from the veterinary clinic. She got Max's microchip information from when they checked him after the fire." Scott looked up, suddenly alert. "And she said there's something unusual about his records. She wants us to bring him in tomorrow morning." Before Scott could respond, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Frank Wilson and a woman he didn't recognize, tall, with short gray hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Scott," Frank said, "this is Catherine Reeves. She saw the news story about Max and drove up from Portland. I think you should hear what she has to say." Catherine extended her hand. "Mr. Miller, I'm the training director for Pacific Northwest Search and Rescue. May I come in?" Once introductions were complete and everyone was seated, Frank and Catherine in the room's 2 chairs, Scott and Rebecca on opposite beds. Catherine got straight to the point. 3 years ago, we had a German Shepherd in our program named Maverick. He was one of our most promising trainees for gas and chemical detection. His nose was exceptional even by working dog standards. But during his final certification, he broke protocol. Instead of alerting his handler and waiting for commands as he'd been trained, he physically pulled a test subject from a simulated danger zone. Rebecca's hand moved to her throat. "Like he did with Emma." Catherine nodded. "Exactly like that. Maverick was brilliant but too independent for our protocols. He made his own decisions rather than waiting for handler commands. In search and rescue, that's problematic. We need dogs that will follow procedure precisely." "So what happened to him?" Scott asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. "We had to wash him out of the program," Catherine explained. "We found him what we thought was a good home with a retired couple in Salem. When they moved to an apartment that didn't allow large dogs 8 months later, they surrendered him to a shelter. We lost track of him after that." Scott and Rebecca exchanged glances. The timeline matched perfectly with when they had adopted Max from the county shelter. "May I?" Catherine asked, patting her leg to call Max. The German Shepherd looked to Rebecca, who nodded permission. He approached Catherine cautiously, allowing her to examine him. "The coloring is right. Age is consistent," she murmured, checking his ears and then gently lifting his lip. "Ah, there it is, the small notch in his upper left canine. This is definitely Maverick." "Max," Rebecca corrected softly. "His name is Max now." Catherine smiled. "Max, then. What I'm trying to tell you is that your dog isn't just a pet. He's a highly trained detection animal who was specifically conditioned to recognize the odor of natural gas, among other chemicals. What happened in your home wasn't random. Max didn't just sense danger in some mystical way. He was doing exactly what he was trained to do, detecting gas at concentrations far below human perception." The revelation settled over the room. Scott found himself looking at Max with new eyes, not just as the family pet, but as a professional who had continued his mission despite being discarded by his handlers. "When he kept going to the basement," Rebecca said slowly, "when he was pacing and whining, he was alerting," Catherine confirmed. "That's what we trained him to do, find the source of the gas and alert handlers. When you didn't respond to his alerts, he escalated, just as he was trained. And when the concentration reached critical levels, he did what got him expelled from our program. He took direct action to remove a vulnerable individual from danger." The weight of this knowledge pressed on Scott's chest. Max hadn't been acting strangely or becoming aggressive. He had been desperately trying to communicate in the only way he knew how, trying to save them, even as Scott had been making plans to get rid of him. "There's more," Catherine continued. "Our program has been following your story since it hit the news. We'd like to formally recognize Max for his actions, and, She hesitated, glancing at Frank, who nodded encouragement. "We'd like to offer him reinstatement in our program." "You want to take him?" Rebecca asked, her hand automatically reaching for Max, who had returned to his position near Emma. "Not permanently," Catherine clarified. "We're proposing a working arrangement. Max would train with us several days a month, using his detection skills to help in emergencies. The rest of the time, he stays with your family. You'd receive a stipend for his care, and he'd have proper outlets for his training." As Catherine laid out the details of the proposal, a news van pulled into the motel parking lot visible through the window. Since the explosion, media interest in the Miller family, and particularly in their heroic dog, had grown steadily. The human interest angle of a dog saving a baby from a house explosion had proven irresistible to news outlets across the country. "They're back," Scott sighed, nodding toward the window where a reporter and cameraman were setting up. "They've been calling nonstop." Catherine followed his gaze, then turned back with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. Miller, I understand you're facing possible legal consequences for the gas line installation." Scott nodded grimly. "And I imagine your insurance situation is complicated." Another nod. "What if," Catherine said carefully, "we work together to shift the narrative instead of focusing on the mistakes that led to the explosion? What if we highlight Max's training and the importance of professional detection work? It could turn this from a story about negligence into one about second chances for both you and Max." Scott looked to Rebecca, searching for her reaction. For the first time since the explosion, he saw something other than guarded neutrality in her eyes, a flicker of hope. "It wouldn't erase what happened," Catherine continued. "Catherine. But it might help create something positive from this disaster, and frankly, having a sympathetic public narrative could influence how aggressively the prosecutor pursues charges." Frank, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. "I've already spoken with some folks at the county building department. They're willing to work with Scott on a diversion program, safety classes, community service hours, teaching proper home maintenance in lieu of more serious penalties. This could help tip the scales in that direction." As the implications of Catherine's offer sank in, Emma began to fuss. Max was instantly alert, moving to the baby's side. Scott watched as his daughter reached for the dog's fur, steadying herself as she pulled to a standing position. Max remained perfectly still, allowing the baby to use him for support. The sight crystallized something in Scott's mind. His family had lost their home and possessions. His reputation and career hung in the balance. They faced an uncertain financial and legal future. But they were alive, all of them, because the dog he had misjudged and planned to discard had recognized danger when humans could not. "What do you think?" Scott asked Rebecca, the question encompassing far more than just Catherine's proposal. Rebecca studied him for a long moment. "I think," she said finally, "that we all deserve second chances. Even you. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an opening, a possibility that their family might find its way forward together." Scott nodded, turning back to Catherine. "Tell us more about this program," he said, "and about how we can help people understand what detection dogs like him are capable of." As Catherine began explaining the details, Max settled back beside Emma, his mission to protect unending. Outside, the reporter waited, unaware that the story she sought was transforming into something far more complex than a simple tale of a heroic dog. 1 week after the explosion, Scott stood alone amid the blackened ruins of what had once been his home. The acrid smell of smoke still clung to the charred timbers despite the recent rain. Yellow caution tape surrounded the property, fluttering in the autumn breeze like tattered flags of surrender. Insurance investigators had completed their initial assessment, and the verdict was as grim as Scott had feared. Their policy would cover only a fraction of the loss, barely enough to clear the debris, let alone rebuild. The adjuster had been professionally sympathetic, but unmistakably clear unauthorized modification of gas lines constituted a policy exclusion. "We'll cover the contents at replacement value," he'd explained. "But structural damage resulting from unpermitted work falls outside our liability." Scott picked his way carefully through what remained of his living room. The couch where he and Rebecca had spent countless evenings was now an unrecognizable mound of springs and ash. The television where they'd watched Emma's first Christmas videos had melted into a grotesque sculpture of plastic and metal. The framed wedding photo that had hung above the mantel was simply gone, as if the 15 years of marriage it represented had been erased from existence. In the corner where Emma's playpen had stood, Scott spotted a partially melted plastic ring, part of the stacking toy she'd received for her 9-month milestone. He picked it up, rubbing the soot from its surface with his thumb. This small, damaged toy was now one of the few tangible connections to their previous life. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Meeting with the prosecutor in 1 hour. Don't be late." The county prosecutor had agreed to meet with them following Frank Wilson's intervention and a character reference from Marshall Caldwell. Today, Scott would learn whether he faced criminal charges for the decisions that had destroyed their home. He pocketed the plastic ring and took one last look at the devastation. Then, squaring his shoulders, he walked to his truck. Whatever consequences awaited him, he would face them head-on. The county courthouse was a stately brick building in downtown Pinewood, its steps worn smooth by generations of citizens seeking justice or facing judgment. Scott found Rebecca waiting outside, Emma strapped to her chest in a baby carrier. They had left Max at Frank's house, no dogs allowed in the courthouse, even heroes. "How bad is it?" Rebecca asked, nodding toward their former home. "Bad," Scott admitted. "Nothing salvageable." Rebecca nodded, her expression carefully composed. She'd maintained this protective emotional distance since the night of the explosion, caring for Emma, coordinating with relief organizations, navigating insurance claims, all with efficient detachment. The raw anger had faded, but in its place was something that frightened Scott, even more: resignation. They entered the courthouse together, but not quite united. The prosecutor's office was on the 3rd floor, a wood-paneled environment of hushed voices and solemn faces. Assistant District Attorney Marilyn Hodges met them in a small conference room, her expression giving away nothing as she arranged files before her. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," she began, "I've reviewed the fire marshal's report, along with the building inspector's assessment and statements from witnesses. The facts are clear. You, Mr. Miller, installed a gas line without proper licensing or permits, which directly led to the explosion that destroyed your home. Scott nodded, accepting the statement without protest. Under Oregon law, this constitutes reckless endangerment, potentially criminal negligence, and multiple building code violations. She tapped a document before her. The standard procedure would be to file charges. Rebecca's hand found Scott's under the table, squeezing tightly. Despite everything, she was still beside him in this moment of reckoning. The simple gesture nearly undid him. However, the prosecutor continued, I've also received numerous communications from your community. Fire Marshal Caldwell speaks highly of your cooperation with the investigation. Your employer attests to your otherwise impeccable safety record as a construction foreman. And frankly, the circumstances of your rescue by the family dog have created a rather unusual public relations situation. She closed the file and looked directly at Scott. I'm offering a deferred prosecution agreement. No criminal charges will be filed if you complete the following 200 hours of community service, specifically teaching home safety classes, full compliance with all rebuilding permits and inspections, and payment of a $5,000 civil penalty to the county building department. Scott exhaled slowly, scarcely believing what he was hearing. No criminal charges, provided you meet all conditions, correct? Ms. Hodges' expression softened slightly. Mr. Miller, you've already lost your home and nearly lost your family. The purpose of the justice system isn't just punishment, it's correction and rehabilitation. I believe you've learned a lesson no court sentence could reinforce. As they left the courthouse, the weight of criminal prosecution lifted from his shoulders. Scott felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. He turned to Rebecca, words of relief and thanks forming on his lips, only to find her eyes brimming with tears. "Rebecca?" he questioned, reaching for her. She stepped back, shaking her head. "Not here," she whispered, gesturing to the public square around them. They drove in silence to the extended stay hotel where they had moved after the Red Cross assistance ended. It was a sterile, temporary space, functional but soulless, with generic furniture and bland artwork. Nothing like the character-filled craftsman home they had lost. As soon as they were inside their room, Rebecca placed Emma in her portable crib and turned to Scott. "My mother called this morning. She's offered to let us stay with her in Seattle until we figure things out." Scott felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. Seattle. That's 4 hours away. What about your job? What about rebuilding? I've been granted compassionate leave for the rest of the semester, Rebecca explained, her voice steady despite the tears now flowing freely. As for rebuilding, Scott, we can't afford to rebuild, you know that. The insurance settlement won't even cover half the cost. And now there's this $5,000 penalty on top of everything else. We can make it work, Scott insisted. My company has offered a loan. Catherine mentioned that stipend for Max's training. I can't do it, Rebecca interrupted, her composure finally breaking. I can't live in a construction zone for months, trying to rebuild on the ashes of our home, jumping every time I smell something burning, wondering what other corners you've cut that might hurt Emma. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Rebecca, I made one terrible mistake. I would never... But you did, she countered. You installed that water heater knowing you weren't qualified. You made that decision unilaterally, without discussing it with me. And then, when Max was trying to warn us about the danger, You were arranging to get rid of him." She sank onto the edge of the bed, shoulders slumping with the weight of accumulated stress and grief. "I love you, Scott. That hasn't changed. But I don't trust your judgment right now, and I need some distance to figure out if I can learn to trust it again." Scott stood frozen, the full measure of his loss finally becoming clear. Not just the house, not just their possessions, but potentially his family, the foundation of his entire life. "What about Max?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "He comes with us," Rebecca said firmly. "Emma needs him. And, apparently, so do we." "And what about me?" Scott asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Do I just stay here while my family moves 4 hours away?" Rebecca wiped her eyes, visibly struggling to maintain her resolve. "I think that would be best, at least for now. You have your community service to complete, your job here, and I need time, Scott. Time to process everything. Time to decide what comes next for us." Emma began to fuss in her crib, sensing the emotional tension in the room. Rebecca moved to comfort her, lifting the baby into her arms. The simple, domestic scene, mother cradling child, now seemed fragile and impermanent to Scott, a tableau he might soon observe only during scheduled visits. "When would you go?" he asked, already dreading the answer. "My mother's driving down tomorrow," Rebecca replied. "We'd leave the day after. 2 days. Just 2 days until he would be alone in this anonymous hotel room, separated from everything that gave his life meaning and purpose. The prospect was almost unendurable. "I made a terrible mistake," Scott said, his voice breaking. "But please, don't punish Emma by taking her away from her father. Don't separate our family." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment, her expression a complex mixture of love, hurt, and exhaustion. "This isn't punishment, Scott. It's protection for Emma, and for me, and maybe even for you. We all need space to heal from this trauma, to figure out who we are now that everything has changed." As the reality of impending separation settled over him, Scott felt a desolation more complete than when he had stood among the ruins of their home. The physical structure could be rebuilt, given time and resources, but the foundation of trust between husband and wife once fractured. Could it ever be fully restored? 3 weeks after Rebecca left for Seattle with Emma and Max, Scott sat in the back row of the Pinewood Community Center, watching as Catherine Reeves addressed a packed audience. A slideshow behind her displayed dramatic photos of search and rescue dogs in action scaling rubble piles, navigating floodwaters, and sniffing through debris. One photo showed Max in a training exercise, his focus intense as he detected chemicals hidden in a test environment. Detection dogs like Max or Maverick, as we knew him, are capable of identifying scents at concentrations as low as 1 part per billion, Catherine explained to the rapt audience. That's roughly equivalent to detecting a single drop of liquid in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. The community forum had been Frank Wilson's idea, a way to educate Pinewood residents about home safety while also sharing Max's remarkable story. It was part of Scott's community service requirement, though he would have attended regardless. Any connection to his family, even second-hand stories about Max's training, had become precious to him. "What many people don't realize," Catherine continued, "is that the natural gas that comes into our homes is actually odorless. The distinctive rotten egg smell we associate with gas leaks is an additive called mercaptan, specifically included so humans can detect dangerous leaks. But even with this additive, leaks can go unnoticed, especially slow ones that build up gradually in enclosed spaces. From his seat, Scott watched his neighbors nod and take notes. He recognized many faces, the parents of students in Rebecca's class, colleagues from construction sites, the barista who had made his coffee every morning for the past year. All these people whose lives had continued normally while his had shattered into unrecognizable fragments. "In the Miller family's case," Catherine said, gesturing toward Scott in acknowledgement, "Max was detecting that leak for hours before it reached critical levels. His increasingly agitated behavior, the pacing, whining, and attempts to draw attention to the source, these were all trained responses to the presence of gas. When those alerts were misinterpreted, he escalated to the final emergency response he'd been taught, removing the most vulnerable person from danger." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the audience. Several people turned to look at Scott, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and something that looked uncomfortably like pity. After the presentation concluded, Frank made his way to Scott's side, clapping a weathered hand on his shoulder. "Good turnout," the retired fire chief observed. "I'd say half the town is here." "Seems like it," Scott agreed, watching as people crowded around Catherine, asking questions about detection dogs and home safety. "Heard from Rebecca today?" Frank asked, his tone carefully casual. Scott shook his head. Their communication had dwindled to brief text exchanges about practical matters and occasional video calls where he could see Emma but struggled to connect across the digital divide. Rebecca remained polite but distant, still working through her own feelings about what had happened and what should come next. "Give it time," Frank advised, seeming to read Scott's thoughts. 3 weeks isn't long enough to process something like this, for any of you." The older man hesitated, then added, "I've been meaning to tell you something, Scott, something I should have said sooner." Scott turned to him, curious. "I noticed the smell," Frank admitted, his voice lowering. "That evening, when I came over to return your drill, there was a faint odor in your entryway, but I figured it was just from the new appliances. Maybe some plumbing work. I should have said something, should have asked questions." The confession startled Scott. Frank Wilson, with his decades of fire service experience, had detected what Scott had missed, yet even he had dismissed it, had not recognized the danger lurking in the Miller home. "You couldn't have known," Scott said, absurdly finding himself in the position of comforting the man who had been his family's rock through this crisis. "Neither could you," Frank replied pointedly. "Not really. You made a mistake with the installation, yes, but the failure to recognize the leak that could have happened to anyone without specialized training. The distinction had never occurred to Scott. In his mind, the entire disaster from faulty installation to explosion had been one continuous line of personal failure. Frank's perspective suggested a more nuanced reality. The installation had been a mistake. But missing the subtle signs of the leak was a limitation of ordinary human perception. As the crowd began to disperse, Catherine approached them, her expression animated after the successful presentation. "Scott, do you have a minute?" she asked. There's something I'd like to discuss with you privately. In a quiet corner of the community center, Catherine showed Scott a folder containing documents and photographs. These are Max's original training records, she explained, including evaluations from his initial handler and notes from the certification test where he was washed out of the program. Scott studied the materials with growing interest. The documents painted a picture of a dog with exceptional detection abilities, but a stubborn independence that frustrated his handlers. One note in particular caught his attention. Subject demonstrates unnecessary physical contact with test participants when alerting to chemical presence, redirects to proper alert behavior temporarily, but reverts when handler attention divides. He was always trying to physically move people away from danger, Catherine explained. Seeing Scott's focus on that passage, "It's exactly what he did with Emma. We considered it a failure of training then. Now I think it might have been an insight we missed." She hesitated, then continued. "I've been in regular contact with Rebecca about Max's reintegration into our program. His sessions have been remarkable. He's retained all his training and seems even more determined now. The bond he's formed with your family, especially with Emma, has given him a clarity of purpose our formal training never achieved." At the mention of Rebecca's name, Scott felt the familiar ache of separation. "How are they?" he asked, unable to keep the longing from his voice. Catherine studied him for a moment. "They're managing. Emma is thriving, as children do. Max is protective as ever. And Rebecca—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Rebecca talks about you, Scott, about your family's future. She hasn't given up. She's just trying to find the right path forward." The simple statement kindled a small flame of hope in Scott's chest. "I've been looking at apartments near Seattle," he admitted, "thinking about a transfer within my company. They have projects in the area. Have you told Rebecca this?" Scott shook his head. "I didn't want to pressure her. She asked for space, and I'm trying to respect that." Catherine smiled slightly. "Sometimes space doesn't mean distance. It means room to process, to heal. Have you considered that she might be waiting for you to show her what you want, what you're willing to do to rebuild your family?" The suggestion lingered in Scott's mind long after the community forum ended. That night, in his sparse hotel room, he stared at his phone, considering Catherine's words. After several false starts, he finally composed a message to Rebecca. "I miss you all every day. I've been thinking about what comes next for us. Not just where we live, but how we rebuild trust. I'd like to talk about it when you're ready. No pressure. Just letting you know I'm here, working on being better, and hoping we find our way back to each other." He pressed send before he could overthink it, then set the phone aside, not expecting an immediate response. To his surprise, it buzzed less than a minute later with Rebecca's reply. "Max misses you. Emma does too. We should talk. Call tomorrow." The simple message flooded Scott with emotion, not just hope, but a renewed determination to rebuild what had been broken, whatever that might require. The following evening, their phone conversation lasted 3 hours. For the first time since the explosion, they spoke honestly about their fears, regrets, and hopes. Rebecca described her struggle to reconcile the Scott she had married responsible, protective, trustworthy with the man who had cut corners on their family's safety. I keep trying to understand it, she said. You've always been so careful at work, so insistent on doing things properly. That's what makes it inexcusable, Scott acknowledged. I knew better, but somehow I convinced myself that professional standards didn't apply to my own home, that I was somehow exempt from the rules I enforce for others. Why? Rebecca pressed, the question she had been carrying for weeks. Why risk it? Scott had asked himself the same question countless times since the explosion. The answer, when he finally understood it, was both simple and complex. Pride, he admitted, and fear. Pride in thinking I could do anything, be everything our family needed: provider, protector, handyman, and fear that I wasn't living up to those expectations, that I was failing to give you and Emma the life you deserved. The silence that followed felt different from the strained quiet of recent weeks, thoughtful rather than distant. I never needed you to be perfect, Rebecca finally said. I just needed you to be honest about our finances, about your limitations, about what you were doing to our home. I know that now, Scott said. I'm trying to learn from this. Beck, not just about home safety, but about what it really means to protect our family. As their conversation continued, they began to tentatively discuss practical matters: where they might live, how they might rebuild their life together, what they needed from each other to restore broken trust. No decisions were made, but the simple act of considering a shared future felt like the first foundation stone being laid. Near the end of the call, Rebecca said, Frank sent me a video of your presentation at the community forum. He said you've been doing really well with the safety classes. I'm trying, Scott said. It helps. Somehow, using what happened to us to help other families avoid the same mistakes. That sounds like the Scott I married, Rebecca said softly. Before they ended the call, Rebecca positioned her phone to show Max and Emma. The German Shepherd lay protectively beside the portable crib where Emma slept, his eyes alert even in the dim room. He still keeps watch every night, Rebecca explained, like he's still on duty. He is, Scott replied, his throat tight with emotion. He always will be. As he ended the call, Scott felt something shift within him, a realignment of priorities and perspective that the explosion had initiated, but that he was only now fully embracing. The path to rebuilding his family would be long and uncertain, but for the first time since watching his home burst into flames, he believed it was possible. 6 months after the explosion, a modest gathering assembled on the cleared lot where the Miller home had once stood. The charred debris had been removed, the foundation repaired, and the framework of a new house now rose against the spring sky. Though smaller than their previous home, the structure had been designed with care, each element chosen for safety and functionality rather than appearance or status. Scott stood beside the building inspector, Howard Chen, reviewing the final permits for the electrical system. Unlike the previous year, when Scott had viewed inspections as bureaucratic hurdles to overcome, he now welcomed each checkpoint, each verification that their new home was being built to protect rather than endanger his family. Everything looks good, Scott, Howard said, signing off on the paperwork. Your electrician did excellent work. You're clear to close up the walls. Scott nodded his thanks, gazing up at the framework that represented so much more than just a rebuilding project. It symbolized a second chance for his family, for his marriage, and for himself. Across the lot, Rebecca supervised as Emma toddled through the spring grass, her first birthday now 2 months behind her. The baby had flourished despite the upheaval in her young life, learning to walk in her grandmother's house in Seattle, celebrating her birthday in a rented apartment, and now exploring what would soon become her new home. Max patrolled the perimeter of the construction site, his movements purposeful and alert. Every few circuits, he would return to Emma's side, checking on her before resuming his rounds. The German Shepherd wore a special vest emblazoned with Search and Rescue Canine in Training, a marker of his dual life as both family protector and working dog. The journey to this moment had been neither straight nor easy. After 2 months in Seattle, Rebecca had agreed to a fresh start, not in Pinewood, where too many painful memories lingered, but in the neighboring town of Riverdale, close enough for Scott to complete his community service requirements, but distant enough to feel like a genuine new beginning. Scott had found work with a construction company specializing in sustainable building practices, taking a pay cut but gaining valuable knowledge about modern safety standards and energy-efficient design. More importantly, his new employer valued his first-hand experience with the consequences of cutting corners, incorporating his story into their training for new hires. Rebecca had secured a teaching position at Riverdale Elementary beginning in the fall semester. Until then, she divided her time between caring for Emma and helping Scott plan their new home, a collaborative process that slowly rebuilt the trust that had fractured between them. Frank Wilson approached Scott now, surveying the construction with an experienced eye. The retired fire chief had become a mentor and friend, driving regularly from Pinewood to check on the miller's progress. "Trusses look solid," Frank commented. "And I see you've got the sprinkler system pipes in already. Not cutting any corners this time." "Not a single one," Scott confirmed. "Every system redundant, every connection professional, every detail inspected. This might be the safest house in the county when we're done." Frank nodded approvingly. "And more importantly, you're building it together," he observed, nodding toward Rebecca. "Not just physically, but as partners." That had been the most significant change, not the location or the design of their home, but the renewed partnership between Scott and Rebecca. Every decision was discussed openly, every financial constraint acknowledged, every concern addressed. The habits of transparency and collaboration that had begun with building plans had gradually extended to other areas of their relationship, strengthening bonds that had nearly broken under the strain of crisis. Catherine Reeves arrived as they were speaking, carrying a large gift bag, since Max's reintegration into the search and rescue program. She had become a regular presence in the Millers' lives, supervising his training and marveling at his continued devotion to Emma. "Sorry I'm late," she called, joining their small gathering. "Training session ran long. We had Max's half-brother there today. Amazing to see the genetic similarities in their work patterns." Rebecca greeted her with a hug, while Emma squealed with delight at the sight of the gift bag. Max trotted over, receiving an affectionate scratch behind the ears from Catherine. "He's becoming something of a celebrity in the program," Catherine told them, watching as Max immediately returned to Emma's side when the toddler wobbled on unsteady legs. "We've had to create a whole new protocol based on his methods. Turns out, his physical intervention technique has applications we hadn't considered, especially for evacuating vulnerable individuals who can't respond to verbal commands." Scott smiled at the irony. "So, the behavior that got him expelled is now being taught to other dogs?" "Exactly," Catherine confirmed. We're calling it the Miller Protocol. Actually, seems fitting. As they gathered for a simple picnic lunch on the lawn beside the construction site, Scott found himself overwhelmed by a surge of gratitude so intense it momentarily took his breath away. Just 6 months ago, he had stood in the smoldering ruins of his home, his family fractured, his future uncertain. The path forward had seemed impossible to navigate. Yet here they were, not fully healed, not completely rebuilt, but unmistakably moving forward together. "Penny for your thoughts?" Rebecca asked, settling beside him on the picnic blanket. Scott looked at her, seeing both the familiar woman he had married and the stronger, more resolute person who had emerged from their shared trauma. "Just thinking about how far we've come," he replied, "and how close we came to losing everything." Rebecca nodded, her gaze drifting to Emma, who was attempting to share her sandwich with Max. The German shepherd patiently accepted the soggy offering, his eyes never leaving the toddler's face. "I keep thinking about that night," Rebecca admitted. "How many things had to align perfectly for us to survive? If Max hadn't been there, if he hadn't been trained, if he hadn't acted when he did. If you hadn't insisted we adopt him," Scott added softly. "Despite my reservations," Rebecca smiled at the memory, "he called to something in me. I couldn't explain it then, but looking back, it feels almost like—" "Providence," Frank suggested, joining their conversation. "Or whatever name you want to give to those moments when life bends in exactly the right direction, just when you need it most." As the afternoon progressed, neighbors from Riverdale stopped by to introduce themselves, drawn by curiosity about the new family moving in and the remarkable dog they'd heard about through local news coverage. Each time Scott shared their story, he found it easier to acknowledge both his mistakes and the lessons they had taught him. "The explosion didn't just destroy our home," he explained to a young couple planning their own first house. "It shattered this idea I had about being able to control everything, about not needing help or expertise beyond my own. I had to lose almost everything to understand what really matters." As the sun began to lower in the western sky, casting long shadows across the framed structure of their new home, Emma began to tire. Rebecca settled her on a blanket for a nap, and Max immediately took up his position beside her, alert even in the safety of broad daylight and familiar company. "You know," Catherine observed, watching the pair, "in all my years of working with service and detection dogs, I've never seen a bond quite like theirs. It goes beyond training, beyond instinct. It's almost like they understand each other on some fundamental level." Scott nodded, remembering the night Max had dragged Emma from her crib, making a decision that human caretakers had failed to make. "I think they do understand each other, both of them innocent, both dependent on us to keep them safe. And when we failed at that job, Max stepped up. He reminds me every day that protection isn't about control," Rebecca added. "It's about attention, awareness, being present enough to notice what matters." As their friends departed and evening approached, Scott and Rebecca lingered, reluctant to leave the site that would soon become their home. Emma slept peacefully, her small chest rising and falling in the rhythm of absolute trust, while Max maintained his vigilant watch. "We should go soon," Rebecca said eventually. "It'll be dark before long." Scott nodded, but made no move to leave. "Do you think we'll ever really feel safe again?" he asked, the question that had lingered beneath many of their conversations over the past months. Rebecca considered this, her gaze moving from their sleeping daughter to the partially constructed house, and finally to Max, whose alert posture had not relaxed despite the hours that had passed. "I think safety isn't what I thought it was," she said finally. "It's not the absence of danger. It's the presence of awareness, preparation, and connection. By that definition, I think we're safer now than we've ever been." As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, Scott took one last look at the framework of their new home, smaller than before, but built with greater care and deeper understanding. The physical structure was only partially complete, but the foundation beneath it, both literal and metaphorical, was solid. Max rose as they prepared to depart, stretching before taking up his position beside Emma's carrier. His mission continued, unending and unwavering, a silent promise to protect what was most precious. "Come on, boy," Scott called softly. "Let's go home." When life crumbles around us like the walls of the miller's home, we often discover what truly matters in the embers. This story reminds us that second chances don't come with guarantees, they arrive with hard lessons and harder choices. For those of us who've raised families, built homes with our own hands, and sometimes let pride overrule prudence, Scott's journey strikes a familiar chord. We recognize that terrible moment when we realize our loved ones have paid the price for our mistakes. But like Max, sometimes salvation comes from unexpected sources, reminding us that protection isn't always about strength or control. Sometimes it's about listening to warnings we don't understand and trusting instincts we can't explain. As we enter our golden years, many of us face rebuilding relationships fractured by time, trust damaged by error, foundations weakened by neglect. The Millers show us it's never too late to start again, to build something smaller but stronger, to value safety over appearance. Their story reminds us that family, whether bound by blood or formed through the mysterious connections between humans and the animals who choose us, remains our most precious possession, worth every sacrifice to protect.